And today we are joined by Dr. Shuaib Manjra, who is an esteemed member and ally of the Palestinian cause in South Africa. Dr. Manjra did his undergraduate degree in medicine at the University of Natal, and later on pursued postgraduate degrees from the universities of Cape Town and Birmingham, the latter of which he was a recipient of the Helen Suzman Fellowship. He has a wide number of interests, two of which include sports and human rights, as can be seen from his membership and commitment to serving on boards, such as the Cricket South Africa board. He is on the selection committee for the Oxford Rhodes Scholarship. He's the chairperson of the board of Indifunda Ukwazi. He's also a board member of the Trauma Center for Survivors of Violence and Torture, along with a number of other NGO involvements. So, Dr. Manjra, thank you so much for joining us today. It's an honor to have you with us. It's an honor to get to speak to you about such a pertinent issue. Our topic for today is settler colonialism and its impact on citizenship and specifically human rights. With that, I'd like to hand you over to Dr. Manjra for a brief introduction on this.
Thanks, Shaniae. Thank you very much for inviting me to present this lecture to the Palestine Solidarity Forum at Stellenbosch University, where I have a daughter studying. So I'm really excited knowing great activists who are similarly involved in the PSF at UCT, where most of my involvement is both as a member of council and a member of faculty. Just a correction, I'm not a board member of Cricket South Africa. We know the shenanigans is taking place at the board level of Cricket South Africa at the moment. I'm merely the Chief Medical Officer for Cricket South Africa, so just a small correction. I also want to issue a disclaimer that the claims I make in this talk are my own and not of the PSF of Stellenbosch University, in order to protect the society against unfair attack by any organized lobby. And for lack of time, I will erase some of the long quotes or legal frameworks or legal references, and it'll allow the talk to flow better. But if anybody requires any of the references, I'll gladly oblige and make it available to you. For decades, scholars and activists have attempted to classify the Israeli-Palestinian question in terms of analogies, theoretical frameworks, or conceptual categories. Some have used the idea of apartheid in South Africa, and others have used the model of colonialism, and yet others have used a subset of colonialism, but what is also a very distinct entity termed settler colonialism. Others have argued that the Israeli state is quite distinctive, and it requires a study sui generis, which means a distinctive. It's distinctive in its construction, rather than casting for analogies or templates that attempts to fit a round peg in a square hole. This generally comes from those who hold on to Israeli exceptionalism. Now, while analogies, theoretical frameworks, or conceptual categories permit us to better understand the world and generalize from specific historical moments, we shouldn't attempt to cast absolute parallels. We need to recognize that each of the three analytical categories I mentioned, apartheid, colonialism, and settler colonialism, within themselves have many iterations, which cannot be compared to each other. For example, colonialism in India was different in many respects to the Americas or to South Africa. The genocide of native populations in colonial conquest may have some differences to the Holocaust, for example. And I don't want to enter that controversy. Dr. Shuaib has already been there. But furthermore, we can situate apartheid in South Africa as a unique event, or we can use a legal definition of apartheid that transcends a local context but has universal application. The Palestinian struggle, I should state at the outset, is close to South African hearts, not only because of the relationship between the Palestine Liberation Organization and the African National Congress, where the African National Congress was trained in PLO camps during the struggle against apartheid, or that there was a common cozy relationship between Israel and the apartheid state, but largely because of our common experiences, both of settler colonialism and apartheid. And these are the two concepts that I want to explore today. Of course, there are differences and similarities in our conceptual understanding of both struggles. And some of these include, one, is there was no mass expulsion or ethnic cleansing of populations in South Africa like there was in Palestine, meaning there was no forcible removal from the country. Of course, people were moved to tribal reserves in South Africa and Gaza and the West Bank in Palestine. So in both instances, there were to some extent internal displacements, but there was no ethnic cleansing of populations out of the country. The second is through mass ethnic cleansing, Palestinians became a minority in their homeland, while blacks always remained the majority in South Africa. And here I use generic blacks, in terms of the constitutional definition of blacks. The third point is that the South African economy was deeply reliant on black labor, and which was a powerful instrument in the anti-apartheid struggle. Not so in Palestine, where alternate labor forces were used, usually non-Ashkenazim Jews. My fourth point of departure in terms of the differences is that in South Africa, even with the group areas and Bantustans, there was significant interaction between various populations. In Palestine, the Palestinians, or in Israel and Palestine, the Palestinians are rendered invisible through the apartheid wall and other forms of legislation. The fifth difference is that in South Africa, we had a significant percentage of the white population which opposed apartheid and found common cause with the black struggle. Although there are elements in Israel, they're not significant like they were in South Africa. And last, and admittedly, Palestinians living in Israel have civil rights and the right to vote, which was not the case in South Africa. But as I will explain later, this is a very limited participation in the polity. Of course, those in the occupied Palestinian territories or who live in East Jerusalem do not have the right to vote in Israel, despite Israel controlling every element of their existence. So those are some of the differences between what South Africa faced and what we face in Israel-Palestine. So coming to the first question of apartheid, which is an interesting one. As I said previously, we can either locate the notion of apartheid to the experience of South Africa, or we can use its expanded definition, which gives it a broader applicability. There's a wonderful United Nations report by Professors Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley, and it's titled Israeli Practices Towards the Palestinian People and the Question of Apartheid. And it's an extremely useful document in that regard. And I've made it available to Shaniae, and she can share it with anybody who wants that document. And I've got hard copies. If anybody wants it, I'm willing to make it available. Now, in their report, they rely on two statutes or conventions to define apartheid. The first is the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, which was adopted in 1973, and which states that the crime of apartheid, which shall include similar policies and practices of racial segregation and discrimination as practiced in Southern Africa, shall apply to inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination of one racial group of persons over another racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. Although the term apartheid was originally associated with a specific instance of South Africa, it now has wider applicability and represents a species of crime against humanity under customary international law and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the second instrument they rely on, and according to which the crime of apartheid means inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. So I'll repeat it. The Rome Statute states that the crime of apartheid means inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. Now, their report is a wonderful forensic analysis of why Israel fits the description of an apartheid state. And the report states, in case there is confusion, that they are relying on a strict legal term apartheid in popular discourse, such as the apartheid wall, economic apartheid, or social racism. Now, the Apartheid Convention sets forth the crime of apartheid as consisting of discrete inhumane acts, but that such acts require the against humanity only if they intentionally serve the core purpose of racial domination. And thus purpose and intention lie at the core of. Now, the doctrine of Jewish statehood, as they consider the Israeli state, is beyond any doubt that there is an argument used that Jews don't classify as a racial group these various hues of Jews, and therefore the definition of apartheid is inappropriate. So, for example, an Ethiopian Jew or an Indian Jew would come and saying, well, you know, we Jews, but we're black, and therefore the notion of apartheid doesn't exist because we've got equal rights. So, of course, who is a Jew is a very vexed question, and one which vexes the Israeli legal system. But the definition of racial discrimination has a broad application beyond the oppressed persons as belonging to a specific race. In fact, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which is expressly cited by the Apartheid Convention, defines racial discrimination as any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. Now, based on this definition, in the geopolitical context of Palestine, Jews and Palestinians are considered as separate racial groups, and therefore the classification of apartheid holds. So we have defined the legislation and the conventions defining apartheid as a crime against humanity, and have defined that Jews and Palestinians can be considered racial groups according to the definition of the Apartheid Convention. Now one is the land policy, and the second is demographic engineering by Israel. Both of these apply to the.
There, Dr. Manjra. We lost you for about 20 seconds.
Okay,
Sorry about that.
I'll just go back a little bit. Reverting to the core purpose of the Israeli regime, its basic law, which serves as the constitution and the nation-state law, which was passed a few years ago, is designed for the core purpose of privileging one racial group above another, essentially to privilege Jews above Palestinians. For illustrative value, we can take two examples. The one is land policy, and the second is demographic engineering. Both of these, remember, are applied to internationally recognized borders of Israel, not the occupied Palestinian territories. So let's take the prominent example of land policy. The Israeli Basic Law mandates that land in Israel shall be held by the State of Israel, the Israeli Development Authority, or the Jewish National Fund, and shall not be transferred in any manner, placing its management permanently under the authority. The Israel Lands Authority manages state land, which accounts for 93% of the land within Israel, and is by law closed to use, development, or ownership by non-Jews. So 93% of the land which is within state ownership cannot be used, developed, or owned by non-Jews. So in summary, the vast majority of land in Israel is nationalized or held by the state or quasi-governmental organization for exclusive control or use by Jews. So that's one. The second is about demographic engineering, which serves the purpose of maintaining Israel as a Jewish state. The first point is that the Israeli law confers on Jews worldwide the right to enter Israel and obtain Israeli citizenship regardless of the countries of origin and whether or not they can show links to Israel or Palestine, while withholding any comparable right from Palestinians, including those with documented ancestral homes in the country. Some of them even hold keys to their homes, which still exist in Israel, but they have no right to citizenship. But any Jew anywhere from around the world has a right to citizenship to Israel. And the World Zionist organizations and the Jewish Agency are instruments used by Israel for this purpose. The second, there are other laws which involve demographic engineering, which are expressed in coded language, such as those that allow Jewish councils to reject applications for residence from Palestinian citizens in Israel. So there's communities can say we don't want Palestinians living here, and this happens very frequently in Israel. Thirdly, Israeli law normally allows spouses of Israeli citizens to relocate to Israel, but uniquely prohibits this option in the case of Palestinians from the occupied territories or beyond. So if a Palestinian marries another Palestinian from the occupied Palestinian territories, they have to emigrate and cannot live together as husband and wife in Israel. And on the fourth point, on a far larger scale, it is a matter of Israeli policy to reject the return of any Palestinian refugees or exiles, totaling some 6 million people around the world, to territory under Israeli control after they had been forcibly displaced. So these two examples, land use and demographic engineering, clearly show how Israel exists as an apartheid state. Now, I don't have time to delve into the details, but the Palestinians are strategically fragmented as a method by which Israel imposes its domination and imposes an apartheid regime. And each one of these areas manifests the definition of apartheid. These include those who are Israeli citizens. For example, the examples I've given above apply to Israeli citizens. And then you've got those in occupied Palestinian territories, those in East Jerusalem, and the fourth group are the refugees. Now, the first group includes discrimination of Palestinians living within Israel who face systematic discrimination in virtually every element of their existence. The most fundamental is that Israel considers its Palestinian citizens with all attendant rights, including voting rights, but within a broader discriminatory framework. There are over 50 laws that discriminate against Palestinians in Israel. So while they can vote, they cannot aspire to power or challenge the laws that discriminate against them. So in Israel, there is a distinction between citizenship and nationality. Only Jews enjoy the status of citizenship and nationality, and Palestinians only have second-class citizenship, but being no part of the nation. The second group are the 300,000 Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem. While Israel claims to have annexed East Jerusalem, which of course is not recognized in international law, by its own claims, it rejects those living there either as citizens or belonging to the Jewish nation state. So like any colonial enterprise, they seek the land without the people. So Palestinians in East Jerusalem are merely classified as permanent residents with no voting rights, except a few who have to apply for Israeli citizenship, and only a few of these are granted. Moreover, on a continuous basis, there is a massive land confiscation, home demolitions, and the entry of settlers into the area to change the Palestinian demographic. It is simply called the ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem. The third group are the 4.6 million Palestinians living in occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza. Now, while fully controlled by Israel and administered in a manner that fully meets the definition of apartheid under the Apartheid Convention, except perhaps for the provision on genocide, every illustrative inhumane act listed in the convention is routinely and systematically practiced by Israel in the West Bank. Palestinians are governed by military law, while the approximately 350,000 Jewish settlers are governed by Israeli law. So this dual legal system, problematic in itself, is indicative of an apartheid regime when coupled with a racially discriminatory management of land, of water, resources, separate roads, freedom of movement, etc. And the Israeli Defense Force protects settlers who daily attack Palestinian villages and destroys their farms and properties. And the fourth area refers to millions of Palestinian refugees and involuntary exiles, most of whom live in neighboring countries. They are prohibited from returning to their homes in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. Israel defends its rejection of the Palestinian return in frankly racist language. It is alleged that Palestinians constitute a demographic threat and that their return would alter the demographic character of Israel to the point of eliminating it as a Jewish state. Now, the report finds that taken together, these four domains constitute one comprehensive regime developed for the purpose of ensuring the enduring domination over non-Jews in all land exclusively under Israeli control in whatever category. Now, for those interested, the report also considers and counters alternative narratives by defenders on Israel on this question. So if you want more detail, you can go back and look at that report. But there is a second report worth reading, and that's quite short, which I've sent also to the organizers. On the 12th of January, 2021, B'Tselem, which is the premier Israeli human rights organization, issued a landmark report, unprecedented in its history. And this report was titled, "The Regime of Jewish Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is Apartheid." It is a simpler version of the Falk-Tilly report, and I would implore everyone to go and read that report. So that deals with the question of apartheid. The second conceptual definition of what Israel constitutes is what is termed settler colonialism. Now, both colonialism and settler colonialism are premised on exogenous domination. The South African Communist Party for many years used another category to describe the South African situation, and people can read on this. It's called internal colonialism or colonialism of a special type, which largely is where the settler colonialists engage in power over indigenous populations through control of land and resources. But I will not enter into that debate today because it was quite a vexed question during the struggle days. Now, colonialism, which is also called exploitation colonialism or extractive colonialism, seeks to exploit the economic resources of a colonized country and repatriate the returns to the metropole. And this is exercised through external control from the metropole, representatives of the metropole in the colony of the colonial enterprise, and your local comprador class, such as your chiefs and your governors. And of course, colonialism also establishes its dominance through an ideological hegemonic project involving culture, language, art, literature, history, etc. But colonialism does not seek to displace the indigenous population, except in some cases, but seeks to exploit their cheap labor. Now, settler colonialism, on the other hand, seeks to replace the original population of the colonized territory with a new society of settlers, usually but not exclusively from the colonial metropole. And settler colonialism involves immigration on a large scale as an outcome of religious, economic, or political issues. So, for example, the French Huguenots had left Europe and gone to the Americas and came to South Africa because of religious persecution. Now, this new society seeks land to establish itself. The settler colonialist project is a new society which seeks land to establish itself. And so settler colonialism depends on access to territory and is therefore without fail engaged in violent dispossession and depopulation of indigenous lands and the destruction of indigenous peoples and cultures in order to replace them and establish themselves as the new rightful inhabitants. So the settler colonialists need to displace original people, and you would remove them forcibly in order to establish yourself and your new society. The logic of settler colonialism is that it destroys to replace. It destroys indigenous societies to replace it with its own, and it involves the systematic stripping away of indigenous history and culture and replacing it with that of the dominant culture of the colonizers. Now, the one common feature of settler colonialism is the genocidal eradication of the indigenous people from the ancestral lands through historical distortion, lying, and myth-making. And this new group needs to manufacture a history, an ideology, sometimes language, nationhood, and religious interpretation to support its claim, essentially what we consider a hegemonic project. And various manufactured legal instruments are used to engage in land dispossession, as we saw in South Africa. And the settlers are considered both by the metropole, but also by themselves as racially superior to the indigenous populations, which may give the settlers' movements and political demands greater legitimacy than those of the colonized people in the eyes of the home colonies or the imperial powers. Now, despite the end of the European colonial empires, settler populations typically remain forever. And in this way, settler colonialism lasts indefinitely. Now, think about the Americas, Canada, North America and South America. Think about Australia, think about New Zealand, South Africa, and Israel. Here, in all of these countries, settler colonialism, which manifested itself, lasts indefinitely. Now, to illustrate this point, I'll quote Theodore Herzl, who was the founder of modern Zionism, and he said, "We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries while denying it any employment in our own country. Expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly." So this is part of the project. The Zionist project fits in with the very definition of settler colonialism. Now, of course, settler populations, while initially fairly homogeneous, are followed by subsequent waves of settlers or immigrants. Now, think about America being populated by the French Huguenots, British settlers followed by the Irish and the Italian. Similarly, in South Africa, we had the Dutch, the French Huguenots, and the English, and then followed by other communities. And some of these countries become a melting pot of popular national sentiment like America, or others remain a collection of insular segregated tribes, or others become a mixture of both. So one may ask a very critical question. What is the difference between a settler and an immigrant? And the foundational difference is that a settler comes to replace an existing polity to his own design. It comes to displace, to destroy, and to dominate, while the immigrant comes to fit into an existing polity. That is the foundational difference between the two. Israel, like all settler colonies, was created on the back of the colonial experience. The 1930s and the 1940s was the height of colonialism in many parts of the world, and Africa in particular. And Israel was created out of that ideology, out of that mindset, and out of that method: violence, ideological justification, a civilizing mission, and racist supremacy. But let's be clear, there were different groups of Jews which formed the Jewish population of Israel. And I'm not going to bore you with the statistics or detail, but give you a broad overview of the question. So there was always an existing Jewish population living in Palestine and Judea since time immemorial, since the time of Judaism's foundation. And the presence go back centuries. In the 1880s, the community of Palestinian Jews known as the Yishuv amounted to about 3% of the total population. In contrast to the Zionist Jews who would arrive in Palestine later, the original Yishuv did not aspire to build a modern Jewish state in Palestine. The second group were religious Jews who migrated to Palestine for religious reasons, seeing Israel rightly as a Jewish holy land, not as a homeland, but as a holy land. And the difference between a holy land and a homeland is important. I mean, if anybody's interested in that question, Shlomo Sands has written a masterfully researched book called The Invention of the Land of Israel, From Holy Land to Homeland. So as far as the religious communities are concerned, there was no mass migration of such populations to Israel prior to political Zionism. Okay. Now, the third group were refugees from the Holocaust who had nowhere to go, as Western countries, including the United Kingdom and the United States, had closed their borders to the victims of the Holocaust. And Palestine was their refuge. Palestine was open with the point when you began to 60,000 of Jewish persecution who, with no other country to accept them, went to Palestine as a refuge. Many of these came from the Union or Eastern Europe, and many of these would be Christians. However, the most important group that was drawn from political Zionism, whose fathers were Theodor Herzl, who was born in 1860 and died in 1904, and Jabotinsky, who was born in 1880 and died in 1940, really planned dispossession of Palestinians. And in fact, he was the first to move the idea of an apartheid war in a different version, of course. So the Zionists were positioned and kind of 1930s and 1940s that Theodor Herzl and Jabotinsky were already well before that looking at the establishment of a Jewish state. Wherever that may be. So initially, the Zionist project was looking for a place, and they looked at Argentina and Uganda, for example. So while while Palestine came in later, they had initially looked at some country. Now the Zionists was smaller and saw the other groups, as I spoke about the immigrants, as essential to increase the number of Jews in Palestine, while unfurling the political project of creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, the victims or survivors of the Holocaust were spirited to Palestine through an instrument called the Havara Agreement in 1935. Now, the Havara Agreement was an agreement between the Jewish Agency, the official Jewish executive in Palestine, and Hitler's Nazi regime. And this agreement was designed to facilitate Jewish emigration to Palestine. And though the Nazis had ordered Jewish immigrants to surrender most of their property before leaving Germany, the Havara Agreement allowed them to retain some of the assets by transferring them to Palestine as German export goods. Now, approximately 50,000 Jews immigrated to Palestine under the Havara Agreement from Germany. But there was also a shift in the religious community. So the religious community, initially, there was a disavowal of a Jewish state as it went against the Jewish doctrine, as religious Jews believed that they were not entitled to return to Israel until after God had sent the Messiah. But subsequently, religious Zionism found common cause with political Zionism, and as is the case of Israel today, there's an alliance between political Zionism and religious Zionism. However, there are small groups of religious Jews who still disavow and condemn the political state of Israel. Now, some of these refugee populations thus also contributed to this ideological objective. For example, the Russian Jews are probably the most extreme of the settler populations that you get now. Now, historical return, and the fourth is the refugees who came from various parts of the world. Now, importantly, the Zionist movement sought various sites for its project, as I said previously, including Argentina and Uganda. But Palestine was chosen because the project could then ride on the back of a religious argument, a promise of God to the Jews, a historical myth of the Jewish return to a historical homeland from where they were expelled centuries ago. And for a further discussion on this, I refer you to Shlomo Sand's another masterful book called The Invention of the Jewish People, a very, very interesting work on the manufacturing of a community. Now, the idea of Palestine was sold to Jews as a land without people for a people without land. So the Jews were considered as a nation and the people without land, and Palestine was considered a land without people. So the Zionist project was based and premised on land without people for a people without land. Now, of course, Palestine was a land with people, with a history, with a culture, with a language, and with a civilization and various religions. But like in Palestine, all settler colonies considered the land what they call terra nullius, or nobody's land, and created all kinds of philosophical and legal language to create the land, as did the American settlers. I mean, they created the land by using philosophical arguments and this notion of terra nullius. Well, it did not work out that way because these lands were populated, and the populations of Palestine and any other land or indigenous community will resist colonization of their land. And thus the Palestinians fought wars of resistance and were defeated by superior military force of the Zionists, who were of course supported by colonial powers. But also important to note that many of the Zionists had already fought with the Allied forces during the wars, and thus had vast military experience compared to the Palestinians, who had lived initially under Ottoman rule and then under Britain. In fact, one of the founders of modern Zionism, Jabotinsky, had set up the Jewish Legion of the British Army during the World War I, and he had set up several paramilitary organizations in Palestine. Now, coming back to the colonial enterprise, Israel was created with the active connivance of the British through the Balfour Declaration of 1917. And thereafter, when the British had the mandate over Palestine, they ensured that this was given effect to. Now, remember that Lawrence of Arabia had already connived with the Hashemite Arabs to successfully drive out the Ottoman Empire from Syria, Palestine, Jordan, and what is called Saudi Arabia, all of that areas now. And once they had assisted him, there was a promise by the British to grant Arabs and the Palestinians independence. But this did not happen because Balfour had promised this land to the Jews in 1970. And Britain had facilitated Jewish immigration into Palestine to ensure the achievement of Balfour's objective. So in essence, the forces of colonialism enabled the settler colonial project. And as in 1936, in Palestinian Arabs launched a large-scale uprising against the British because they saw what was taking place, the colonization of the land, and talk was already there about splitting the land up. And the uprising against the British and the support for Zionist settler colonialism was known as the Arab Revolt. And in this revolt, the British authorities crushed the revolt violently, and this revolt lasted from 1936 to 1939. And it destroyed at least 2,000 Palestinian homes, put 9,000 Palestinians in concentration camps, and subjected them to violent interrogation, including torture, and they deported 200 Palestinian nationalist leaders. At least 10% of the Palestinian male population has been killed, wounded, exiled, or imprisoned by the end of the revolt. Now remember, this is before the Nakba. That 10% of the male population was virtually destroyed by the British. Now, there is a valid claim in academic literature that Nazi Germany's Holocaust project was resultant from his learnings of his colonial projects. And Stephen Robbins, in his book, Letters of Stone from Nazi Germany to South Africa, he identifies continuities between German racial science and eugenics developed in the 1990s in the German colony of Southwest Africa, which is currently Namibia, and the policy of Nazi racial hygiene policies that ultimately led to the mass killings of Jews, Roma, Sinti, and other victims of Nazism. And I would argue similarly that Zionism was predicated on such colonial experiences in both its conceptualization and execution. Now, between 1947 and 1949, during the period where there was a sellout of Palestinians and the United Nations was deciding to unequally divide Palestinians or divide Palestine, Zionist paramilitary forces launched a vicious process of ethnic cleansing in the form of large-scale attacks aimed at mass expulsion of Palestinians from their towns and villages in order to build the Jewish state, as all settler colonial projects are. And this culminated in the Nakba. Between 1947 and 1949, at least 750,000 Palestinians from a population of 1.9. Zionist forces had taken more than 78% of historic Palestine, ethnically cleansed and destroyed about 530 villages and cities, and killed about 15,000 Palestinians in a series of mass atrocities, including more than 70 massacres. So So we can see how settler colonialism was denuding Palestine of indigenous populations. And now these Palestinians are found in the diaspora or in the occupied Palestinian territories or even within Israel, where at that time 150,000 remained. Of course, some argued that all of them should have been expelled. And there's an argument in Israel now that some of them should be expelled as well. And even those that were within Israel were internally displaced. And although they were granted Israeli citizenship, they were stripped of most of their land and they were placed under martial law from 1948 until 1966. Interestingly, most of Gaza's population is derived from the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Now, Zionists and even Israeli academics argue that the violent ethnic cleansing of Palestinians was a necessary condition for the creation of a majority Jewish state. While in most civil democracies around the world, the notion of majority and minority is determined through a ballot. Israel's construction of majority and minority was pre-political. It was necessary for any claim for Israel as a democracy, but within a majority Jewish society. So before you had what you call a democracy, you had to ensure that there was a Jewish majority. And the only way you did that is by expelling Palestinians. So basically, we will give everyone the vote. So anyone who remains in Palestine, or what we now call Israel, we will give you a vote. But first, we must establish our majority through ethnic cleansing. That's how the state was born. Now, the effects of the settler colonial project and its impact on Palestinian human rights is evident. It is similar in some senses to the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. And if you listen to or read Mahmoud Mamdani's book about, between, citizenship and colonialism, and where he looks at the differences between how Afro-American slaves were dealt with in America and the indigenous American Indian population, you'll kind of get a good idea in terms of why there's the continuities between what happened in America and what happens in Israel and Palestine. And Mamdani argues in another lecture that the more appropriate analogy of Palestine is the United States rather than South Africa. But that's another argument. But what I mean in that sense, there's a continuity between the Black Lives movement, Black Lives Matter movement, the movement of indigenous peoples in America, Australia, and New Zealand, and the Palestinian struggle. But what makes Israel unique in a sense is that the project of settler colonialism is till today a daily project. That the Nakba did not end in 1948 or in 1967, it continues until today in the form of Israel's ongoing theft of Palestinian land for Jewish settlements and for Jewish communities inside Israel. It's destruction of Palestinian homes and agricultural land. It's revocation on a daily basis of residency rights of Palestinians, it's deportations of Palestinians, it's periodic brutal military assaults that result in mass civilian casualties, such as the one that took place in Gaza in the summer of 2014, and the denial of the internationally recognized legal right of the return of millions of stateless Palestinian refugees. So the settler colonial project has never stopped. It's a continuous project in Israel and Palestine. And there's a daily violation of human rights and fundamental human rights. In fact, there's war crimes created and crimes against humanity within Israel, the occupied Palestinian territories as well. I will conclude my talk with the conclusion of the reports of Professors Falk and Tilley, which imposes obligations on us as students and faculty, the university in our country. And the report concludes that the weight of the evidence supports beyond a reasonable doubt the proposition that Israel is guilty of imposing an apartheid regime on the Palestinian people, which amounts to the commission of a crime against humanity, the prohibition of which is considered jus cogens, the principles which form the norms of international law that cannot be set aside. So it is jus cogens in international customary law. And therefore, the international community has a legal obligation to act within the limits of the capability to prevent and punish instances of apartheid that are responsibly brought to their attention. More specifically, states have a collective duty: 1, not to recognize an apartheid regime as lawful; 2, not to aid or assist a state in maintaining an apartheid regime; and 3rd, to cooperate with the United Nations and other states in bringing apartheid regime to an end. They continue that civil society institutions and individuals also have a moral and political duty to use the instruments at their disposal to raise awareness of this ongoing criminal enterprise and to exert pressure on Israel in order to persuade it to dismantle apartheid structures in compliance with international law. And the report ends with a general and specific recommendations to the United Nations, national governments, and civil society and private actors on actions that they should take in view of the finding that Israel maintains a regime of apartheid in its exercise of control over Palestinian people. And thus, friends, we have a duty to fight on until apartheid in all parts of the world ends and is destroyed. Despite the spinelessness of American and European elite, who when asked to bend by the pro-Israel lobby have rather chosen to crawl, we need to stand up and struggle for the rights of Palestinians and for intersectional struggles around the world. And I thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manjra. I think that was an incredibly insightful talk. I know I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure our members will find this very valuable. I have a couple of questions because I think you raised some interesting and particularly non-conventional standpoints on this. So the first question is, given that this is necessarily an issue of legality as opposed to just morality, and you make specific reference to ideas of the use Cogans and customary law, and specifically the Apartheid Convention. My question becomes, okay, well, look, we know that the US and NATO nations tend to side with Israel on these issues of Israel-Palestine. But of recent, we've been seeing nations like the UAE, Egypt, Dubai, they've started welcoming and normalizing political and economic ties with Israel. So given that there is this international obligation to fight against apartheid, when Palestine's so-called closest allies don't do that and they actively side with Israel, what can we as South Africans do? You know, what does this mean for the international solidarity for the Palestinian struggle? Sorry, Dr. Manjra, I'm not sure if you've cut out or if I've cut out. Hi, Dr. Manjra, really sorry about that.
Sorry, Shaniae, I think it was perhaps it was my problem, so I really apologize for that.
No problem. Did you manage to get the question?
I've got I don't think you finished your question. You were somewhere along the United Arab Emirates, so perhaps you want to rephrase that question. Okay.
Sure. So given that there is an international obligation to act against apartheid regimes, to take a stance to bring this to an end, and we know that the US has been complicit. We know that the UN in very many instances have also been complicit. Given the normalization of economic and political ties by Arab nations like the UAE, like Egypt with Israel of recent, how can we expect the international community to rally in support of Palestine when Palestine's so-called closest allies, like the members of the Arab League, can't do so?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. But just to begin, I think it is both a moral and Palestine is both a moral and a legal question. But the legal elements are important. It's something I focused on today. So if you look at the history, Shaniae, if you look at the history of the Palestinian struggle, it's been a history of betrayal. So the Palestinians have been always betrayed either by other Arab regimes. So it's nothing new. I mean, what we're seeing now by their betrayal by Arab regimes is a repeat of history. The Palestinians basically have been on their own. Now, if you look at the history of the Palestinian struggle, initially the Palestinians relied very much on the frontline states to try and assist them. And there was a constant betrayal. I mean, you just got to look at Black September in Jordan and see how Palestinians were brutally murdered by the Jordanian regime. So I mean, these are undemocratic monarchies, which cannot be called democracies in any way. The Arab street is very different from these Arab regimes. So initially, the part of the struggle was that the Palestinians relied on the frontline states to try and assist them, and obviously they got very little support. So they got some financial support, but very little. Basically, these Arab regimes are looking after their own interest. Then it moved on to the PLO, which was based externally in Beirut. And then the PLO was decimated when Ariel Sharon went into and destroyed Beirut basically and drove the PLO out. And then you've got then you've got the Palestinian Authority, and then they relied on the international community. They relied on the United States and the UK and the European Union to try and get some kind of solution. And none of these have brought any success to the Palestinian cause. And finally, I think what's happened now is the Palestinians suddenly realize we are on our own and we've got to do our own thing. And therefore, you're getting more Palestinian initiatives coming out in terms of Palestinian civil society. You're looking at numerous communities which protest daily. You're also getting huge movements in Israel itself from Palestinians and non-Palestinians. But to me, the most important game in town is the BDS campaign. I think that's probably the most important one at the moment. But the fact that they've been sold, down the drain by the international community, I think that's sad. But it's not surprising. I think these were not friends from the very beginning. But we need to continue to use the instruments. So currently, I mean, the International Criminal Court, the case before the International Criminal Court is an important one that we need to continue to argue for. And we know that the International Criminal Court has decided they've got jurisdiction over the Palestinian and Israeli question or areas of territories, and they're going to listen to that case. But also importantly, I think we need to use legal instruments in other parts of the world. So for example, in South Africa, we need to use, I mean, if, what the report says in terms of apartheid that Israel practices, we need to use legal instruments in South Africa to enforce that. Now, I spoke about land confiscation and I spoke about land being held, 93% of land being held only for Jewish use. I mean, one of the major instruments of that is what we call the Jewish National Fund. Now, the Jewish National Fund has a presence in South Africa. How can an organization which is responsible for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, maintaining an apartheid regime, legally operate in this country? And they do it through various instruments. But to me, part of what we need to do is begin to look at more innovative legal instruments to fight some of these cases in South African courts to try and ensure that at least if we're not getting through to the international communities, we're using legal instruments in South Africa. But to me, the most important one currently, hopefully, would be the International Criminal Court. And we can see how the Americans and the Brits are trying to scupper that. And I'm sure with the support of the Emiratis and the Saudis. But hopefully the International Criminal Court will bring some kind of resolution. I mean, ultimately, what happens in the questions of Israel and Palestine, I think, it's a matter for history to kind of find a solution to it. And the Palestinians themselves, we should never derive the Palestinians of agency in terms of what they need to do and what mobilization within the country, needs to happen. The best way we can support them is through legal instruments, the BDS campaign, etc. But to me, the most important thing is about us educating ourselves. We need to learn more about what's happening there in Israel and Palestine. I think it's critical. It's probably one of the struggles of our time, together with the issue around Black Lives Matter. I think these are the two critical points in our history.
No, definitely.
Yes.
Thank you for your thoughts on that, Dr. Manjra. The second question that I have is perhaps more controversial. So Dr. Saig, who is an American Palestinian scholar on specifically settler colonialism, characterizes the Zionist settler state as having three elements. Firstly, a racial complexion that is perpetrated or at least maintained through racist conduct. Secondly, an addiction to violence. And thirdly, a commitment to expansionism. And focusing especially on the second element of the addiction to violence, I know you drew parallels between this and the Black Lives Matter movement, this in South Africa. Another scholar on this topic, Patrick Wolf, says that settler colonialism in Israel-Palestine is characterized by a structural genocide. To what extent do you think these claims are valid? Given that a lot of the Israeli arguments claim that this is a state of ongoing conflict and there aren't any power dynamics which position them as the oppressor, are they able to perpetrate this sort of structural violence or addiction to violence?
Well, I mean, I think I've mentioned this in my talk, and I think the 3 points I made about the racial element of it, the racial hue, or the violence and the expansionism. I mean, they're fundamental elements of settler colonial societies. I mean, if you look at colonialism in South Africa, for example, and how the colonialists who settled had expanded out and basically reduced over time the amount of land that local indigenous populations had, that effectively blacks own 13% of the land. In fact, there's an argument that says that 13% of land protected black land because, if that 13% wasn't there, they would have taken all of the black land. Similarly, you saw, the kind of frontier wars that took place in the Americas as well, where when the settlers come, they're not happy with the law. It's expansionist. It has to be expansionist. By definition, settler colonialism is expansionist. And there's going to be resistance from indigenous populations. People don't want to move off their land for which they've been for centuries and for generations. So by its very definition, it's violent. So to me, Zionism, colonialism, settler colonialism is by its very nature a violent ideology. And you see it from the power dynamics. I mean, for people who say that Israel doesn't have the power, they've got inordinate power for violence, for state violence. And in Israel, not only do you see state violence, you see paramilitary violence, and you're seeing violence by settlers, which goes unpunished. So essentially, Israel is a violent society towards Palestinians, both in a sense of structural violence, but a daily experience of physical violence. So we speak about racism, as structural violence. And we speak about apartheid as structural violence, but Palestinians face structural violence every day, but physical violence every day as well, and that's a daily lived experience of Palestinians. I mean, you read of stories of Palestinians going home and their cars being burnt or being shot at, or their farms or their olive groves, which have been there for centuries, olive trees being burnt on a daily basis, people coming in and burning their cars at night or stoning their windows or kidnapping their kids. And I mean, this kind of daily violence, or Palestinians who need to go and work in Israel, how they've got to go through cages and this, all of that. It's a daily experience. So it's a violent society by its very nature. It's a military society.
No, definitely. Yeah. I think that raises some questions about justice. So in your talk, you mentioned how the construct of settler colonialism isn't like colonialism in that it seeks to perpetuate itself in drawing a distinction between the oppressor and the oppressed, or the colonizer and the colonized, but rather to naturalize itself and displace a people through destruction. And you used examples like the Native Americans, the Aboriginals, the Maoris. I think in a lot of those instances, we're facing the repercussions of that. So it's a generational thing. Whereas with Israel-Palestine, it's still very much ongoing. the issue of First Nation peoples being displaced. And so my question around justice is justice for the Aboriginals, the Khoisan, that has to come in the form of reparations. But do you think that justice in a Palestinian context would also need to take that form? Do you think that self-determination is the form of justice that we should strive for? How can we get some recourse?
So I mean, I think you've kind of, in your question, you've also got the answer. And the answer is, I mean, you mentioned the point that in the questions of Aboriginal populations, in Australia, or the Maori population, or the indigenous populations of the United States or North America, or even in South Africa, for example, we're looking at restitution, we're looking at reparations. In Israel-Palestine, we're struggling to stop the continuation of this project. So we haven't even stopped the project. Forget about reversing it or seeing restitution or some kind of sense of justice. We're trying to stop this ongoing project, which is continuing on a daily basis. There's daily confiscation of Palestinian land. There's daily confiscation of Palestinian water. There's daily, Palestinians are being, disenfranchised on a daily basis. They've been deported. People being imprisoned without trial. So we're looking at, very basic stuff. We're trying to stop this project, not to try and reverse the project. Now, where does the solution lie? I don't know. So people speak about one-state solution and two-state solutions, and I don't know. It's for the Palestinians to decide what they want. It's not for us to pontificate to Palestinians what the solution should be. But from a human rights perspective, clearly we believe, I, for example, believe in a unitary state where all people must live together. I love secular democracies. We live in secular democracies. I wouldn't live anywhere else, because any state which is an ethnocratic state, or a religious state for that matter, by its very definition excludes and others people, and therefore the only solution is a secular democratic state of all its citizens. That's what a state must be. And therefore, the way that Israel and Palestine has been fragmented, I think a one-state solution is probably the only solution. And people like Peter Beinart, who's kind of, who was a liberal Zionist for much of his life, Peter Beinart's coming to the party and saying, well, I think this is a solution at the moment. Now, the problem with that is that if you have a one-state solution, Palestinians will always be the underclass, because unless there's a sense of restitution and a reconciliation, and what we've had in South Africa through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, if there's a one state and there's some kind of affirmative action to bring up Palestinians, they will remain second-class citizens as they are. They would remain the poor. They would remain the underclass. So that's a challenge of a one-state solution. But I think with all its faults, it's probably the better option. If you look at the two-state solution, again, you're going to be an imperial vassal state. That's what you're going to be, because you're going to be constantly controlled by Israel and attacked by Israel, and your borders will be controlled by Israel. So you'll be a vassal state. So, and unfortunately, we've got examples in that area where some of these states are unfortunately governed by demonic leaders, and unfortunately Palestinians have such leaders in the Palestinian Authority you've got at the moment, who sometimes who behave worse than Israelis. So that's the problem. That's the problem with the two-state solution as well. But unless the two-state solution is configured in a way that is a viable contiguous state. How do you have a state in the West Bank and Gaza? How do you have contiguity in terms of that? And what happens to the Palestinians in East Jerusalem, for example? So that's the kind of the vexed question. And Israel has not, they've delayed this because all they've done under the ruse of a peace plan is to change the facts on the ground. So they on a daily basis change the facts on the ground. So the longer this whole process delays, they benefit because they change. The status quo, holds, and they change the demographics, they change the status, and then they negotiate from a new status. That's what happens all the time. So yeah, I don't know what the solution is, but I think a one-state solution is probably the solution at this point in time, because there's no viable Palestinian state as it stands.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your thoughts on that. My last question is more personal. This is from a member of the PSF. They ask how you has being a member of the UCT Council influenced your opinion on the BDS movement, and has being so openly pro-Palestine negatively affected your career?
Thankfully, no, it hasn't. It hasn't affected my career. And part of the reason is that my struggle for justice is an intersectional justice. Palestine is part of my passions for justice. It forms part of what I do for social justice. So whether I'm dealing with the land question, or whether I'm dealing with survivors of violence or torture, or whether I'm dealing with health justice, it's an intersectional justice. So Palestine can't stand out for us as one point of justice only. Our justice needs to be all-encompassing. So I think very much when people see me, they're looking at somebody. I hope so. I mean, I don't know. I'm speaking for myself. Somebody who looks at justice through an intersectional lens and not through a parochial lens. And clearly at UCT Council, we've had challenges around BDS, and we kind of not we, but the PSF at UCT had passed a motion of, calling for a boycott of Israeli academic institutions, and that went all the way up to Senate, and it passed the first vote, and then it was defeated in the second vote. So there's been some successes. Successes. We've fought these battles at council level as well, but you've got to be in spaces to fight battles. Whatever battles they are, whether it's about Palestine or other battles about justice and racism or whatever, you've got to be in those spaces to fight battles. So I would implore people to be in those spaces. But when you're in those spaces, don't be a token and fight the battles. It's a tough job. You get a lot of pushback and a lot of fight back, and you get lots of bricks thrown at you, and you've just got to take it and come along. Accused of all kinds of things. I had a headline in one of the right-wing Jewish papers calling me an anti-Semite, but that's par for the course. You've got to take it as it comes.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you so much for the work that you've done in relation to not just Palestine and Israel, but with all your human rights endeavors. Your contribution is incredibly valuable. And again, thank you so much for your time today. I think I'm definitely going to go sit down and process and try to digest everything. But it really has been a privilege hearing your thoughts on this. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, Shaniae. And I wish the PSF at Stellenbosch University great strength for the future, and always willing to assist you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Manjra.
Cheers.